Just making sure everything looks good up here. Yeah, are you guys set up?
Yeah, I think so.
Perfect, awesome.
Hamburgers out of the way. So how do we see show hands on this?
Oh, so that's it's this. It's up at the top, so we can start to show of hands.
Yeah, that's show of hands, but no, that's for. I think that's a poll.
It is. Yeah, that's the show of hands.
Yeah. No, I was actually looking for the queue. And I think this
Oh, the queue. Yeah.
So the queue actually starts here.
Right.
Queue.
That is new. Yeah. Okay. Okay, we'll take that as unanimous consent. Thank you. Sorry, the tools have changed a lot since the last time I shared something. So finding where all the buttons are, I think we're good. All right, excellent. Okay, I think we're good. Hello, everybody, and welcome to WIMSE. They threw us into the very first slot, a working group slot at least, here in IETF 119. So welcome to Australia. And first off, everybody note the note well. If you're unfamiliar with this, it basically means anything that you contribute, which is things that you say in the line or in the mic line or on the list, or are considered contributions to the IETF. Those are potentially recorded and made public, likely to be because we already do have a note taker. So assume that what you say will be considered a contribution. If you have anything that's covered by patents or other restraints like that, it's up to you to divulge that. And if you don't, well, that's there's a whole bunch of legal stuff there that says that's your fault. I'm glazing over this a lot. Please, if you're interested in that, in the details of what all that means, there's a lot of good information in there. And ultimately, don't be a jerk. Be nice to each other. And we will get along just fine. So, this is our agenda for the day. Before we really dive in, I want to encourage everybody, please scan the QR code or sign in with the on-site tool through the agenda. There's a link there. This is how the Secretariat knows how many people show up in each meeting. So if we want to have a correctly sized room in Vancouver, this is where they get the numbers from. You don't show up in that list unless you scan that code at least once during the space here. Also, this is going to be the only way that we're going to let you get to the mic and actually say something. So please, everybody scan that. And all right. So let's dive in. Murray, already got a comment from the AD.
Just a quick administrative point.
Yes.
I'm your sponsoring AD until after plenary Wednesday, and then Ori will be taking over.
Oh, okay. Is it too late to change that?
How much money you got?
I already owe you a beer, so I mean, we're okay.
Just a reminder, all of this is going in the record, so
Yes, I know. I've known Ori for ages. We're all good. Thank you, Murray. So WIMSE is the workload identity in multi-system environments. It was also multi-what environment? Multi-service environments at one point as well. We will accept both. And we're pronouncing it WIMSE. I am firmly a believer that you can't dictate how people will pronounce an acronym in the wild. So, you know, that's where we've got. So congratulations, everybody. We're a working group. I want to extend a particularly huge thanks to Yaron and Joe for chairing the BOF and helping run the effort of getting the charter in order. It was no small feat for us to go through all of the hoops to get chartered between the last meeting and today, between Prague and now. And a huge thanks to the ADs, Murray and Roman specifically, to really help us get through that process. And yeah, so here we are. My name's Justin Richer. I've been around the IETF for a while now. I've been able to edit a whole bunch of different documents, mostly in the security area. I've also done some work in standards organizations outside of the IETF. I have previously chaired a working group, version 1.0 of Cozy back in the day. All of the tools have changed since I was last chair, so that's why you'll occasionally find me like fumbling about the buttons, but we'll get there. I work with a variety of different clients as a consultant, and that is way more dressed up than you will probably ever see me at an IETF meeting in that headshot photo.
Right, I'm Peter Castleman. I am your co-chair, or the co-chair for WIMSE. I'm an identity standards enthusiast, mostly working in the OAuth working group so far. And this is my first time, so looking forward to making some great standards and solving some of these very important problems in the workload identity space. And thank you, everybody, for bringing yourselves and helping us address this area. Thank you.
To clarify, this is Peter's first time as chair, not his first time ever being at the IETF. Just to, in case you were a little nervous. All right, and every working group needs a logo. So we asked an AI to help us out. And honestly, I'm not sure we can get better. This is, it keeps giving more the more and more you look into it. Was that? It was intelligent that it made this. I mean, I can't really argue with it. We are the working Claude Graujip, working Glod rather. Yeah, I was wondering what the transcriptor would do with that. But anyway, so if anybody has an idea for branding, feel free to do that as a project. Drop it to the community. But this is certainly something. Now that we're a working group, though, we put a lot of work into getting the charter in order and pointing at some initial stuff. Now is when the real work actually begins. And now is when we actually have to start pulling documents together and figuring out what it is that we're going to be delivering here. So to start us off, we need a basic idea. This is the workload identity in multi-system environments group. What is a workload? There are a lot of extant definitions out there. The one that we're generally going with is, because this is the text that we agreed on as part of the charter, is that it's a running instance of software that's executing for a specific purpose. Now, I fully expect this definition to be augmented and refined and all of that as the working group moves on. But this is kind of the baseline of where we're starting here. And the idea here is that when you're going and deploying a system in a cloud environment these days, you're going to have a lot of little pieces that are talking to each other. Each of those pieces probably does one specific thing. This is a very common style of architecture. And so each of those is going to be a workload, and they're going to be tied together into a system that actually services various requests and things as they go through the system, right? So then what is workload identity? Quite simply, it's a means of identifying a workload in a way that makes sense in that context. And really, ultimately, it's this context of workloads that really is what makes the stuff that we're going to be doing in this working group different. Keeping in mind things like, I not only want to know who's calling me, but I might want to know who called them to call me. Like, what was the chain of things that came through? How can I maybe look at that from an auditing perspective later on? When I'm crossing a security boundary, what does that even look like? Which gets us to the next part of our name and definition. What do we mean by multi-system environments? Well, that means that the problems that we have and that we're dealing with, they don't start and stop at cloud boundaries. We need things that work across systems as well as things that work inside systems. So it's not good enough to just stand up a CA and assign everybody certificates and then go home. We are interested in the types of problems that go beyond that. And this slide's been trotted out a bunch ever since I proposed this at Dispatch. Was it last summer? And the whole idea here is really that these workloads and these systems that we see, it really is turtles all the way down, because one thing that you're calling may in fact be made up of a bunch of submodules that's calling other submodules, and there's just a lot of complexity that's built into systems these days, that's just kind of inherent with cloud environments. Long gone are the days when server meant a physical computer sitting on a shelf somewhere plugged into an Ethernet cable. You know, that's not the way that we build, scale, and deploy things by and large. All right, so I like to think of the main thrust of the kinds of things that we're doing here as solving problems that are unique to these workload environments and contexts. Oh, I thought, okay, I was making sure Meet Echo didn't die over there. No idea what's going on. So solving problems that are unique to the workload environments, because when you're spinning up all these different services and they're talking to each other and need to reason across that, then that's some pretty unique stuff. But also looking at general problems in the unique context of a workload environment. You know, identifying a caller across a single hop, that's not unique to workloads. But when that caller may stand up and then spin back down in the space of a couple of microseconds, that adds some interesting challenges. Richard. Okay. We're by and large going to focus on the identity and security aspects here, and but here I want to point out we are in the applications area. We're in art. We're not in sec, but we are going to be having a strong liaison relationship with sec. This is going to be a security focused working group, even though we're not in the security area, and we are focusing on this one particular vertical. So you'll see a lot of cross-pollination between those kinds of things. And finally, we want to really make sure that we are bringing a lot of lessons learned from outside. We know that this is not a greenfield space. People have solved a lot of these problems out there in the wild with their own versions of duct tape and baling twine in a lot of cases, and in ways that are highly contextually specific and not necessarily, you know, abstractable. One of the things that we want to make sure that we're doing here is paying attention to what's happening out there in the wild and bringing those conversations in and making sure that anything that we bring out of this working group keeps that sort of more global context in mind. Mark, is this for now? Okay. Richard, go ahead.
Just wanted to kind of briefly confirm an understanding about scope here, because I feel like I've heard you mention a couple of different dimensions. You know, identities, you know, when we talk about identities and workloads, there's kind of provisioning aspects, how do workloads obtain the identities, and then presentation aspects about how those identities get presented to other things. You know, provisioning things tend to be more their own things, and you know, presentation stuff tends to get integrated with applications. So I just wanted to confirm that, like, we're trying to address both of those in some sense here.
Yes, more so on the presentation side than necessarily focusing on the provisioning side, although a lot of the stuff that we're doing is going to touch on that, which I think is actually, yeah,
Fantastic.
a little bit in the next slide is what we're not doing. And one of the most important things I think that this working group needs to keep in mind, though, is that even though we're not focusing on solving those problems like SBOMs and whatnot, the stuff that we're going to do is going to touch on that. Yeah. And like, this is what provides the context that makes the stuff that we're working on here unique and interesting. Mark? Oh, okay. No, just a couple more in the intro bit. So anyway, I'm not going to go through all of these points, but it's important to know kind of where the boundaries are on what it is that we're not trying to solve. The way we're going to go about this is that during the chartering process and sort of the months leading up to today, those that have been on the list have identified a set of, you know, sort of small focused key deliverables to start. And we're going to be developing those into a set of RFC track documents, but also, and especially for things like the use case document that was submitted as an ID, curate resources that are non-RFC track, things that will help the working group and, pardon me, the wider community really figure out what the shape of this space really looks like, and the things that we care about. One of the most important things about this space, though, is that we want to make sure that we remain a discussion forum for the larger workload identity community, which is to say that the things that we'll be talking about and sort of, addressing in discussion is going to be beyond necessarily the things that we're going to be addressing as actual working group artifacts. And finally, we're going to make sure that we have a strong liaison relationship with a lot of related groups. So then comes the question: if somebody has a great idea and it's not a working group document, what do we do with that? We're going to be taking the approach of, if there is a space that actually fits it, because WIMSE is touching on a lot of different related areas. If this is better as a RATS extension or as a SCIT extension or an OAuth extension or something, then we should really be encouraging people to make sure that stuff fits in the appropriate places. If we're filling gaps in those other protocols, we want to make sure that we are working closely with those protocols. But in the spaces where we're really kind of between things or not really well aligned with those, we want to make sure that we actually do have a space to create new work here. And so that's really we're trying to do, look at those things in a lot of different ways. All right. I want to reiterate here that even though our deliverables, as we've proposed them today, are limited, our discussion is not. Our deliverables are focused on HTTP, and that's a deliberate choice. A lot of workload stuff runs on non-HTTP systems. There's what, gRPC, Kafka, and probably a bunch of other weird proprietary stuff that I don't even know about. We want to be able to talk about that kind of stuff. We want to be able to consider that as we're looking at solutions. And so if something is specific to HTTP or even specific to a particular version of HTTP, then that needs to be an actual choice of the solution. Does this mean that we can't work on general things that generalize across different delivery mechanisms or different crypto containers? Absolutely not. But these are the bits that we've signed up to work on and make sure we deliver now. And so we need to make sure that we are delivering those even as we build out the community around these larger goals. And finally, we need to keep in mind as a working group that as we start to deliver good and interesting stuff, that's how we get permission to work on more stuff. We don't get to claim that we're going to solve all of the problems right out of the gate, because we haven't proven that we can solve any problems yet. And so, we've got a few things targeted that we'll bring up at the end of the session here that are really going to kick us off. If you're not on the mailing list, please join WIMSE at IETF.org. It's the same mailing list that we had pre-working group, because it really is a fantastic acronym. I cannot take credit for that. It was Roman and Joe, I think, right? That was confirmed. We do have a GitHub set up. There's nothing on it yet because we don't have any working group documents yet. We will be doing most of our working group work between these two resources, between the mailing list, as is tradition in IETF, and also on GitHub for doing a lot of issue tracking and document editing. And with that, I am actually going to step down, and we have I should have kept the agenda up next. George, please come up. I can put your slides up, unless you want to share from your thing. Okay. Oh, yeah. Just let me know when to change slide.
Yeah, you can go to the next slide. Okay, so my apologies for not having more slides to try and sort of explain all this. There are some talks in the past, but I'll try and go through the main points here. Transaction tokens is work that we're doing in the OAuth working group. The concept here starts with an assumption that oftentimes the authorization model of things outside your perimeter is different than the authorization model internal to your perimeter. And so there's this sort of transition between authorization boundaries. And then if you're doing a transaction, right? So let's, maybe you have an instant messaging client and the authorization model of the client's different than what you have internally. And I'll give a more detailed example in a minute. Then when you transition the perimeter, what can you do internally to actually make things better? And the reason for that is oftentimes our perimeter environments have a couple of different kinds of models, right? You can have like everything inside the perimeter is able to do anything else, right? Which hopefully most people have gone away from. You can have sort of machine to machine based sort of security, like I'll authenticate that this machine's allowed to call this other API at this other machine, or workload in this particular case. But the actual elements of the transaction are arbitrary, right? There's no sort of binding as it flows through. And so this was a way to, how can I basically get something internal to my perimeter that allows me to bind aspects of the transaction that should be immutable throughout the call chain that Justin described in his slides through the system. So that's kind of the thinking. And if you think about OAuth, which is where this sort of has been originating, I tend to have OAuth scopes of like, I need to be able to read my messaging information. I need to be able to write stuff into my messaging information. Internal to the perimeter, the transaction that I'm doing might be add Fred to the, colleagues working group, or, make sure I get a notification whenever George sends me a message. And those are much more fine grained, right? So your authorization models are different. We can actually, with a transaction token, you can basically effectively downscope from the OAuth model that you have in the client to something much more fine grained internal to the system. And this is not necessarily, there are lots of people that have done similar things in a proprietary, within their own implementations. I'm not saying this is like something new, but it was a way to try and codify it from a standards perspective. Another use case would be an email system where you're getting inbound email delivery, and you basically want to bind the inbound email address to the transaction so that as it goes through spam, the spam system and the antivirus system or whatever, you can't actually manipulate the delivery of that particular message. So transaction tokens basically codify like what's the subject of the transaction, which could be a machine or a human. What's the context of the request, of the transaction request? Things, that could be things like IP address or a device that made the request, or any other things that could feed into other authorization aspects. You have basically, are there other aspects of this particular transaction that should remain immutable? And then the expectation is that internal to your system, instead of passing all this other data, you basically can just pass a transaction token when you invoke the next workload API or service. Sorry. Oh, great. So transaction tokens themselves are signed JWSs today in the spec. By the way, that link should point you to draft 01, which got published yesterday. There's also a key element of this is the requesting workload. So in order to get a transaction token, you need to have authenticated the service that's requesting it. Part of this is that a transaction token service, part of that, the purpose of that is to allow for some level of authorization, right? Is this requesting workload authorized to get a transaction token for this finer grained purpose? So it's not trying to solve the authorization problem, but allow for the ability, let's say for that transaction token issuing service, to call a PDP and do dynamic authorization as well as static authorization. And then finally, and this is something I think as we work through this, we can decide whether there's other models, but the transaction tokens are intentionally not intended to be sender constrained, because generally in a sender constrained environment, you have to go get something that's unique to you every time. There is a pathing mechanism supported in here. So like if between, what was it, bar and calling the next gateway in the other group of Justin's diagrams, bar wanted to get a new transaction token, the pathing would stay. So there's a little bit of the pathing piece there. I'm not sure it's the right piece, right? We're still in draft 01. But the intent is that in most of our systems, transactions are very short-lived, right? I mean, probably less than a minute. And so the hops back and forth to some AS to get a new sender constrained token that you can pass to the next one adds a lot of performance implications. And this is still adding, substantially increasing the security of a trust boundary, even if it's using Barrett tokens. So I'll pause there. That's the summary. The spec is not very long. It shouldn't take, it's a pretty quick read. And obviously we're happy for feedback here or in the OAuth working group.
All right, speaking as chair, to be clear, this is a draft that is currently in OAuth, but it is definitely relevant to what we're doing here. And there may be some additional coordination, which we'll get into when we start to talk about the specific deliverables. So not seeing anybody on the queue. Any questions or comments? Richard.
Since nobody's, I'll give people time to think of their other questions. Yeah, I kind of hate bearer tokens. I'm a sender constraint enthusiast. So I think, but I appreciate the need here for something that you can pass through multiple layers. Just want to suggest that you might consider like more of a chaining thing where you could have layers of signatures that could cover things.
Yep.
Like BGPsec has these sorts of designs. Not that that's a like widely deployed thing, but like it may be worth considering whether you could have sender constrained things here, and just arrange a few more signatures to make the chaining work.
Thank you. Yep.
Okay. So they're fixing something.
Justin.
Yes. Speaking as individual, so one of the interesting things in the workload space is that the notion of sender is not nearly as well defined as it is outside the workload space. Because you may care about the sender several hops up, you may care about the sender just before you may care about both. And so I'm really just to add to what you're saying, definitely is something that is very important, but this is, to me at least, one of the things that makes the context of this working group a more specifically challenging set of problems than we would have outside of it.
Yeah, I appreciate that there is that ambiguity. I think bearer tokens reinforce that ambiguity. Yeah. So I think one way this working group might be helpful is to elaborate and try and help clarify things, how things might manifest better in certain workload cases, and have clearer boundaries.
Excellent, thank you. Braun, and okay, sorry, I was just gonna say I don't know how to remove people from queue, but I just found that button.
Excellent. There's a bunch of work happening at the moment in DKIM for email delivery, which is very similar to this in a lot of ways. You have multiple systems that don't trust each other, and you don't know what the source system is. One thing we've discovered looking at how DKIM works now is that if you're going to sign anything, you need to not only sign the past, you need to sign where things are going as well, because otherwise you can replay that workload to a completely different system. So as soon as you start looking at signatures across something, you need to sign something that can't just be cut back and replayed.
Thank you. And Peter, as chair or individual?
As individual. So just one comment, I think, on the constraint, sender constraint nature. I think something else that might also be interesting to think about is not just constraining to a sender, but maybe constraining to a transaction, right? So I think there's different ways in which we can limit things like replay. And maybe it's not just about the sender, but there might be other kinds of bindings to consider as well. And this is all work that I think we can explore in this working group. Chair had back on.
Yeah, so you can.
A tool.
Yeah, I was just going to respond to the earlier comment about DKIM. I mean, one of the key things here is that the transaction tokens are, short-lived, and so we are less concerned about replay attacks here. And I don't know how it is with DKIM, but that's probably a differentiator here.
Thanks, Atul.
All right. I think we've drained the queue. Thank you all very much. Okay. Next up. I think Kelly is going to be presenting this one. Yes. All right. Do you want control or do you just want to next slide?
Yeah.
I can move for you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, hi everyone. Kelly Bergen here to talk to you a little bit about identity and authorization chaining across domains that we're doing in the OAuth working group. Next slide.
Oh.
Yeah, ahead if you want. Yeah, you recognize the diagram. Thanks to Justin for creating this. It's been very useful in our explanations here. So you've got a resource owner who has authorized a client to get an access token from the authorization server in its domain. And then it presents that token to the resource server in its domain. The big box is the resource server inside our services of that resource server. And the final service may want to know some information. Who is the resource owner? What authorization did they grant? What other entities were involved? And what authorization did they have? Next slide. So part of the problem that we're trying to solve is, well, what happens if the protected resource, the resource server in the first trusted domain needs to access one in a second domain with a separate authorization server? Next. And that final service within that resource server will want to know the same questions, the answers to those same questions. And next slide, we want to think about this in an OAuth setting. So there's an authorization server. Each domain has its own authorization server. And so we need to get the client an access token that it can use for the resource server in domain 2. All right, so the concepts that we've put together next. One more, please. Yep. Oh, you got it. Thank you. All right, so it's a three-step process based upon standards, existing standards within in OAuth. We're going to use token exchange and the assertion framework. The high-level description of how the client goes from getting, it has an access token for use in its domain, but it needs one for trust domain 2. So it's going to exchange the token that it had for an authorization grant for the AS in trust domain 2. It'll then use that authorization grant to get an access token from trust domain 2, authorization server and trust domain 2. And then present that to the protected resource, to the resource server in trust domain 2 to get access to the resource. Next. All right, so this is what's in the draft right now. This is a high-level overview that sort of the sequence diagram explains, where does the token exchange occur, where does the authorization grant occur. So generically, there's going to be a client in, well, we've switched to domain A now. So there's a client in domain A who needs access to a protected resource in domain B. So if the client doesn't already know the authorization server, it can do discovery. Then it exchanges the token for an authorization grant, which it then presents to the authorization server in domain B. Gets the access token to get access. Next, and we have two specific cases of this. One where the resource server is acting as a client. And in this case, the resource server may need to get some metadata about the protected resource in domain B, and then it follows the same pattern, right? It exchanges the token for the authorization grant, presents it, and then gets access. There's a second one where the authorization server in domain A acts as the client. That's the next one, please. And so here, since the client is now an authorization server, it can generate its own authorization grant. Right? It doesn't need to go request it. It generates it, and this is sort of what we're called the internal token exchange. Right? So it's generating this assertion grant based upon the information that it had before, and then you follow as before. You present the access token to get access. And this is it. I tried to be quick. If there's time for if there's time for questions, I wanted to make sure we did have some, but this is the basic proposal of what we're doing. There'll be more details in the OAuth working group on Wednesday. I just wanted to give you a high-level overview right now.
All right. So I do want to say once again, this is work that is existing in a different working group, but very much related to the kind of space we're looking at here. So with that in mind, anybody have questions or comments for this piece of work? All right. Not seeing anybody. Oh, Richard is. Yes, thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
So I apologize. I'm coming to this pretty fresh. It seems like there's a presumption here that something in domain, that there's some broker, someone has prearranged something to be
Yes, there is some
in
sort of
domain A
relationship.
and domain B. So like, where is that swing point? Is it like the authorization server in domain A that has gotten some capabilities in domain B so it can issue?
Yeah, there has to be some sort of trust relationship and also some agreement on formatting and things like that. So that there does have to be between the authorization servers to make this happen. Thank you.
All right. And Roy.
Roy Williams, have you thought through what would happen with JWT tokens or CWT tokens in this flow from A to B? Do they get stripped or do they get carried through?
We are restricting ourselves to JOTs.
Okay, so the same
But
concept.
the answer is no.
You haven't figured it out, or
We haven't thought about it. I'm sorry.
I'm actually curious, Roy. Can you tell us more about the question? Why did the question of stripping come up for you, or stripping of the tokens?
The question is whether the tokens are unique to the first domain and leak information into the B domain. And it comes into question of, have we thought through the barriers of B going back out to A with data exposes some stuff. I'm just concerned that we need to think through some of the discussions we were in the previous one versus this one of leaking bearer tokens and things through the workflow.
Did you want to follow up?
So we are thinking about adding sender constraint mechanisms to this document, not to the transaction tokens, but to this.
Arndt, I see. Oh, sorry, Kelly, you had
No,
another comment?
I thought I was done. I was gonna
No,
say thank you.
I see a question. Arndt, do you want to? You had
Yeah.
a question? Yeah.
No, actually, I wanted to talk about the thing that was just raised. So we have a section on claims transcription where we go into a bit detail who's in control, what claims get transcribed to the other trust domain. So in the first step where the client exchanges its access token to an authorization grant for the other domain, the authorization server can have policy in place to decide what sort of claims gets transcribed into the piece of information that gets sent into the other trust domain, right? So that can be translation of user IDs, stripping claims, all that sort of things.
Okay, thanks, Arndt. I don't see anybody else in the queue, so if folks are interested in this, please, we'll continue the conversation in OAuth. And again, this crossing of trust domains being relevant, I think, to the work we're doing here. So thank you, Kelly.
All right. Thank you.
And before we move on, I want to realize that I realized that I cut Mark off. Did you have something to add? Okay, we're all good. Cool. Just wanted to make sure. Okay, and next up, we have Joe.
All right. Hi, I'm Joe Salloway, and along with Hannes and Yaroslav, we've been working on an initial attempt at a WIMSE architecture document. Go to the next slide. Yeah, we're just going to talk briefly about kind of where it's at, what we've been aiming for as goals for this document, and maybe what some of the next steps are. Kind of one of the important things is we do have the draft up on GitHub, and we've already had some folks kind of put up some PRs and make some issues up there that are very helpful, because without community input, this is going to be something we really need some collaboration. But next slide. So for goals, we kind of have, just a few small things like terminology is one thing we're trying to align on in the document. Justin already mentioned, we have some concise definition for workloads, but there's a whole lot of other things that we've talked about during the formation of groups, from context to just even the notion of identity itself and what that will comprise for us is something we'll need to discuss. So there are, I'll talk a little bit about what's in the document now, but the other area that I think is very useful for us that we want to focus on is kind of the security properties that we're going for. So looking at the threat model for the environment we're building to, and then deriving security requirements and security considerations from that. So we kind of understand what it is that we're building. One of the problems I think we have today with workload identity and systems that are in place is it's not really well understood what the properties that people are going for, and then also once they've kind of deployed something, what properties they've gotten. So I'm hoping that we can make some progress in this area by defining that better in the architecture document. Perhaps this might be a separate document at some point, but I think right now it makes sense to keep it in this document. And then, obviously we want to talk about architecture, where we get into the different types of system components and how they interact. Next slide. So this document's in a very early stage, you know, so there's, we're looking for, you know, more contributions to kind of get it going. We can just kind of go through the next slide, which will talk a little bit about, you know, what sort of terminology we've also already have in the document. You know, we workload, we've defined something about a context. There's some notion of identity proxies and agents and attestations. And part of the thing we also see is that like a terminology like attestation, there are different groups that are involved here between, say, what the way IETF uses the word attestation and the way Spiffy uses the word attestation means slightly different things. So there's some kind of reconciliation of some of this terminology and figuring out what we mean when we say it. Let's go to the next slide. So for architecture, we really haven't sketched out too much, but we have talked a bit about, you know, the initial identity establishment and what that looks like, largely because we already had some documents relating to this. So it was a kind of a natural thing to do. As you know, how much of these interactions would be, you know, something we would standardize is, you know, up for consideration. But certainly understanding how this information gets there makes a difference in the security considerations you may have. But you know, there's some discussion of kind of service authentication, also on context propagation and some cross-boundary issues, but it's all very sketchy at this point. Next slide, please. And then in the security considerations, there's just some outlining of, you know, threats on traffic interception, information disclosure, and workload compromise. But there's probably many other things that people are concerned about. And I know Peter, I think, has put some additional issues in the tracker for us to look at. Next slide. So next steps, I mean, the document is also, you know, needs some general cleanup and alignment in various areas. And then there's just lots more that needs to be done. I think we'll leave, you know, questions on adoption for later. But certainly we'd love to have more reviewers and more people collaborating on this document. I think we will try to get a new revision out soon, at least to kind of clean up what's there, because it's kind of looks like it was written by 3 different people, because it was. And that's fine, but we ought to have it a little more coherent. That's all I have. I guess one question is, how many people have taken a look at that document? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe 8, 9, 10 or so. It's not bad. Any questions?
I just want to make one quick clarification as chair here. Looking at adoption is later today, actually. We're going to be talking about that later as part of this meeting, as to where this is, not later as in 3 months. Just to clarify.
Peter?
As chair or not chair?
Non-chair. Question about. Do I need to walk? Okay. So a question, Joe. You mentioned writing down things like security properties or security promises. Are you also thinking about doing that specifically to facilitate things like formal analysis? I'm kind of just curious to get a sense of how you're thinking about that formulation of the security properties.
I mean, formal analysis is something I've thought about, but I don't have enough background in formal analysis to know how achievable that would be with this type of, you know, a fairly complex system. I'm more thinking about in kind of, a less, I'll say less rigorous security analysis or less formalized security analysis. I guess it's not rigor, it's more the formalization to understand what pieces do and where we're putting our trust in and things of that nature. I wouldn't object to trying to move to a more formal definition of those things. I think that could be really good, but I think it's also potentially a lot of things we'd have to do to get there. Richard.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to plus one the idea of having this document elaborate these, the security guarantees we're after. I think that will help clarify in the way that architecture documents clarify stuff. The architecture clarifies what we intend to build. The security goals articulate what we intend to achieve that way. I think it's not crazy to think that formal models could be useful here. I've done a little bit of modeling of access control systems using the standard formal modeling tools, and it can be super helpful in both finding vulnerabilities and confirming that you're getting what you're getting. So yeah, I don't think we're going to capture like a complete formalizable thing here, but I think we could get something that's concrete enough that you can kind of look at a formal model and just say that this is articulating basically what we want.
Yeah, I think even if we just define the things are that we want, that would give us a step to getting towards the formal model.
Yaron.
Yaron Chef, a quick reminder that in addition to security considerations, we're also supposed to have privacy considerations. And of course, even though this is about workloads, we will be carrying privacy sensitive information like all over the place.
Yep, that's a very good point.
Mohammed.
Yeah, since formal methods were mentioned, so I would just like to mention that we are also working on with the COCO project, KBS, which would be very relevant. So we have expertise there. We are trying to formalize the security properties of the protocol KBS, and we can help also for the protocols that you have.
Okay.
Can you maybe type just the name of that activity in the
Yeah, sure.
chat as well? Thank you.
Sure. I will write in the chat.
Excellent, thank you. And I would actually encourage you to drop a note to the list as well, so that there's more record there. Yeah.
Sure, thanks.
Any other questions or comments? All right.
Okay, that's it for that queue. Hannes, you're up because I went in the wrong order.
Yeah, we'll be brief. Oops.
Not allowed to break things.
Okay. So there's a short update on the best current practices for this workload identity. I spoke about the document that is on the slide at the last IETF meeting at the BOF. In the meanwhile, we have had a sort of, obviously we spend a lot of time on working on the charter text and the deliverables and everything that related to the formation of the working group. But we have also sort of checked interest in specific items, including this one. And so our authorship expanded, but we didn't manage to submit the document in time for the deadline. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we've been thinking about and maybe or hopefully get your feedback as well. So you see a couple of new names here. For example, Jaroslav, Eduardo, Arndt, Eben was also in our conference calls to give us a little bit of background on Spiffy-Spire. Yeah, okay, next slide. So this is what I just said. Next slide. A short refresher of what is currently in the document. It's somewhat narrowly scoped. You may remember still what I said at the last meeting, or you may have even read the document. So just very briefly, 2 slides So this was work that was motivated by several of us looking at Kubernetes and how it used JWTs as or provisioned JWTs into workloads. And it did it in a way that was unfortunately a little bit ambiguous, so that there was interoperability suffered between different implementations, specifically on the way how the claims in those JWTs were populated and then later used, which is specifically used an extension, this RFC 7523 with the shiny name JWT profile for OAuth2 client authentication and authorization grants. We've heard about OAuth and some of the work, so probably many of you are familiar with that. And there's an OAuth document, and then there's a profile in OpenID Connect, and that's where some of the misinterpretations come from, because some implementations, OpenAuth authorization server implementations, just implement a variant of OpenID Connect for OAuth usage, which is kind of a little bit weird. Anyway, the document talks about what you should be paying attention to when sort of populating and passing the claims. Next one. And here's a diagram, architecture diagram on how this information flow actually looks like, and relates a little bit to what Joe has been talking about earlier, and even earlier Richard had brought up that issue. On the left-hand side of the diagram, you see this flow on how these the JWT or identity or credential, and depending on how you want to call it, gets provisioned into the workload. Kubernetes in this specific case uses its own terminology here, and when that information gets populated into the workload, there are different techniques to do so: file system, environment variables, or for example, some APIs, domain sockets, for example. And then those tokens get then exchanged against something that was just presented from the work in OAuth to actually then access services within that local environment, services that are running on other workloads here referred as resource servers, which is a separate exchange that this specific document doesn't talk about. It's sort of, so there's one part where the provisioning happens and the lifecycle management, and another part where the actual usage internal to the workload environment. Okay. Next slide. So, okay. So the document currently is really narrow focused, very much inspired by Kubernetes, and talks about this JWT, so Richard's bearer tokens. It doesn't go into like how would you provision and manage kind of the BOB tokens, the tokens that have a key associated with them, or X509 certificates like Spiffy would do. Spiffy has these too. It has the JWTs and the X509 certificates. So it only focuses on a subset of those. And the question is obviously, is that a good scoping? The benefit or the plus on the plus side of this narrow focusing is obviously that we could finish such a document much faster. It's obviously something that people use today out in the wild, so they would immediately benefit from it. On a negative, or I don't know, negative, but the downside of the narrow scope is obviously we would have to deal with the other token types in some other documents, or not at all, or depending on whatever the group wants to work on. A proposal that was made up, or that was brought to us in the conference calls that we had, was to also look at the or compare the different techniques for passing these tokens into the workloads themselves. Which approach should we recommend? Or obviously there are pros and cons. We should at least list the pros and cons, which are currently is something we are not doing right now. You could also argue that maybe that belongs in the architecture document, more than in a specific BCP, but maybe also in POST, depending on how you phrase it and how widely scoped the architecture document is. The domain sockets specifically, they give you a lot of power because it's a bidirectional communication. You have sort of like all sorts of information flowing back and forth and changing of tokens and sort of managing the whole life cycle of them. Yeah, and we talked, the last item is something we talk about later anyway. Okay, Richard, do you have any comments?
Yeah, you know, you shouldn't just focus, you really should be using sender constrained things here. No, but
no, I understand.
Yeah, for the BCP framing, I think that's like what the scope you've articulated here is okay, right? Like we can at the same time say like the best current practice, given what is currently out there today, is to do certain things, you know, handle your JOTs, right? While at the same time working on stuff that is more oriented toward sender constraint stuff. So I think that's okay.
Yeah, definitely. So like the, so as I said, like in SPIFFE, you have both, you have the X509 certificates and the JWTs. Actually support for both, but not concurrently. You can also argue that both are, both use provisioning, both would be valuable because they could potentially stay at a different layer. You could use the X509 certificate for mutual DLS at the lower layer between neighboring nodes, but then to do the JWTs potentially with what Depop at the higher layer. That would be one possibility, for example. But it's I don't think this would be the current best practice, to be honest.
Yeah. So just stepping into that as a chair right now. Right now, the deliverable itself is framed as a BCP. If there is additional work that would be looking at, you know, defining new protocols and things on top of that, I think we would probably consider that a different deliverable, but very much within the general reach of the working group, if not necessarily something that we're doing right now.
Diego.
Yeah, just a matter of curiosity, because I have under the impression that it's a little bit too early for a BCP when we don't have the architecture and the other pieces.
Hold that thought. We'll go over the thoughts around sort of the nature of the architecture document and how this group has been discussing it today.
Looking at them, to me, I mean, they seem that they are very close and probably could be merged, but that's I don't know, because I was not in the origin of everything, so I probably am not aware of everything. But
yeah, so hold that thought. We in the next section we are going to go into each deliverable, and I think we will come back to that question. So I encourage you to ask that again once we go there. Thank you. It isn't. I want to be clear that that is an important question: how these documents fit together and how this working group is going to be addressing them going forward. But a lot of that is part of what we're going to try and figure that out today.
On one aspect, though, the relationship between sort of, or the distinction between a BCP and the architecture document, which is informal in nature, I was like, from the experience of the work on other architecture document, they are more high level and not sort of don't describe a specific solution, but they instead sort of try to bubble it up and introduce terminology and the things that Joe mentioned beforehand. So I wouldn't expect an architecture document to go into the details of here are the claims that you need to populate in a JWT and how they actually go in and go out and get matched and so on. So I think putting the content in there into the architecture document wouldn't it be a right to me, like in terms of what I would expect to read in an architecture document. So I see them differently, but obviously there's some relationship, like even my struggle with writing the slide on how do I call the nodes is obviously something that would be nice to have some clear terminology on. Each sort of real world deployed solution today uses different terminology, and so trying to come up with some more generic terms would be useful.
Evan.
Hey folks, can y'all hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. I think I'm the one who put in the chat too. I think I'm the one who kind of called out this local issuance, documenting these local issuance patterns. I do think that we should. There are a handful of them, and they come with different pros, cons, and there's nothing out there, right? There's no way for people to kind of reason about when they should reach for which one. So I do think it would be valuable to capture somewhere. That said, you know, and Spiffy kind of looks at identity separate from credentials, and you can have multiple credential types proving a single identity, right? So like the certificate and JOT thing simultaneous actually does work. And this issuance mechanism is also kind of decoupled from the credential type, right? Because we're talking more about like transport and this kind of stuff. And so, you know, my feeling is that maybe it does kind of belong in architecture. There is like some kind of current practice text as well. But it is certainly like a lot broader in scope than the first bullet point, for example. And I don't know if it's worth broadening the document to take in this piece.
Did you want to respond to that?
No, yeah, I don't know
Okay.
myself, so.
All right,
yeah.
that's totally fine.
Okay. Right, there's nobody else in the queue, and I think we're just almost on time. So, Justin.
Sorry, I gotta find the right slide. Give me a sec. Feedback from somewhere, is that us? That stopped, whatever it was. Okay. Yes. Okay.
I'm just keeping an eye on the chat. I see there's a discussion about BCP or not BCP. I don't know, Richard or Pete, if somebody wants to maybe just come to the mic and explain a little bit about your thinking behind the differences between those.
This is Pete Resnick. BCPs procedurally are a mess because they're one-step things that get full standard kind of approval. They're just weird in the process. Really, there's this thing that used to be called applicability statements, which is a horrible name for them, but it's basically saying you can have things on the standards track which describe usage and all that other stuff, make it a proposed standard, make it go with the other documents. You can either have it as part of one document or separate documents, but BCPs in the IETF are just an icky thing, and they get used for all sorts of stupidity, and it's probably just better to call it an AS if you don't like the name applicability statement, but just put it on the standards track and keep it there and put it with the rest of the documents.
Reverend.
Sorry, what was that, Murray?
What? Yeah. What? Reverend is what? Oh, okay. Got it. Thank you. I thought I misheard that.
All right, yeah, missed that.
Richard.
That reference. So Pete, I was just wondering if the upshot of that recommendation is just to like aim this, set the intended status field in the data tracker to propose standard and not BCP. Okay. Whatever.
Yeah. Microphone, please.
And then call it whatever the heck you want.
Right.
I mean, it's just that BCPs in IETF land in procedurally are just stupid.
All right. Yeah. Best current proposed standard it is. Right. All right. Yeah. So with that in mind, the charter as accepted, you know, we by the IESG and hashed over a lot by this crowd. Again, thank you to everybody who put into that. Has a bunch of deliverables in it. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through each of the deliverables as they're written down in the charter, and basically add a little bit of commentary to each, and then we're going to come back to them and discuss them. So I'm going to just go through all of them at once so that we have all of those sort of in mind. and then we're going to come back and open the mic for each of them to discuss. Clear on procedure? Awesome. All right. So first deliverable is about securing service-to-service traffic. So this is a token, specifically something Jose-based, that is proposed to protect a set of HTTP calls. So this is Jose and HTTP specific, very narrowly scoped in terms of the deliverable. Something that works within a trust domain and also across domains. Now, those might be different, the way that they get instantiated, and the properties might look different, but the idea is to have a solution that can be applied in both spaces. The document is intended to support identification of microservices and cryptographic binding of the token to the caller's identity, Richard. We got a thumbs up. And also optionally binding it to the overall transaction. As I mentioned in the introduction here, one of the things about workloads is they come with this sort of, long transactional context that you don't see in a lot of, sort of traditional token and sender constraining systems that we need to think about here. So it should support associating pieces of that context with the token, including but not limited to user identity and all that other stuff. The goal of this deliverable is to have both a token format, something Jose-based, possibly a profile of Jot is the intent, including binding the caller's identity in that format. Oh, and usage of the token. Sorry, missed that as I was reading it. The next bit is local issuance of token. We struggled about how to actually capture this succinctly. What this is really about is the ability of a component inside of a workload system in order to get its own token in order to call another system. So it would be able to generate a token within its own context with a limited authority, without having to call a token exchange system, without having it handed to it by the environment. Hannes, is this a clarifying question? Okay.
So you started with the previous slide and said that the first item, is it the first because it's the first in the slide, or is it the first because it's the first one to be finished?
Well, it's up to you guys to finish
Oh, okay.
it. So, I mean,
No, I mean, but do you make no assumptions? You just put them in a random order, or
they're not in exactly a random order, but they're also not in a strict delivery order either.
Okay.
That is an important clarification. I will say the one that is not in a random order is the architecture, and I have that last for a reason that we'll get to in a moment. So anyway, this is about, you've got a piece of software and it can make its own tokens within a specific limited context. Now that context might include incoming access tokens or incoming identities or, certificates sent to it or whatever. But the point here is that this is about, you've got a thing that can make its own tokens, that can kind of sign its own tokens. Next up is token exchange. This is something that needs to go call an external service, deliberately call an external service and say, I have one token and one set of contacts, and I've got another, and I need to get something else to go out there. This is specifically targeting how do you get this, this WIMSE token, which was the first deliverable at security boundaries, possibly based on the OAuth token exchange document as transaction tokens is profiling today. And in addition to specifying sort of how we would expect people to do this token exchange, profile a small set of sort of exchange profiles between one flavor of known token and context to another. Next up is token distribution. This is, again, naming things is hard. This is really along the lines of what Hannes was talking about in his second closing bullet point of when you're delivering tokens, outside of this active network context. It's coming in an environment, it's coming in on the file system because people actually do that. It's coming in through some other mechanism. What does that mean? What are the security properties? How do you use it? What should you put in a token like that? What shouldn't you put in a token like that? That type of thing. And finally, the WIMSE architecture. This is a document to define, I mean, you guys, Joe, I think, did a much better job of going into detail about this, but common terminology on attestation identity, a threat model, and architectural components and compositions of those components. I want to point out here that we do not expect the WIMSE architecture to be a monolith. Nor do we expect it to be universally applicable to everybody's workload setup. The diversity of the community that's already started to join the conversations is showing us that people are taking a lot of very different approaches to how workloads are handled. Some of those are radical differences. Some of them are subtle but important differences. And it's going to be the goal of the architecture deliverable to capture as much of that as we can, compare and pull abstractions where possible. And ideally be able to pull out scenarios that describe where each of these makes sense, where you would apply and not apply, and that type of thing. And ideally come to that for interoperability. Now, one of the reasons that I put this point last to Hannes's question is that in the run up to this working group, there was a lot of discussion about which of the deliverables we thought would be better suited for early and rather later. And this is to basically to finally get it back around to Diego's question. We are expecting the architecture to be descriptive of sort of the other environments and the other work, and not prescriptive, sort of defining everything and leading that. So that said, the proposal, which we're going to call for adoption in a moment, is to start work on the architecture alongside all of this other stuff, but not expect this to be finished before we deliver anything else. Taking my chair hat off, speaking as an individual, I personally think it would be a fool's errand for this working group to go down the rat hole of trying to figure out what the grand single architecture of WIMSE would be before we actually try and solve the specific problems that inform that architecture. Which is why it might feel like it's a little bit backwards. We're hitting point solutions before we have an architecture. A lot of the reason for that is that there are a lot of point solutions already out there. There's a lot of stuff that already exists. This is not greenfield. And so the architecture is something that we will need to describe and grow out of these evolved systems as we go forward.
Yaroslav, you've got a question.
Yes.
And just please stand close to the mic so folks online can hear.
Absolutely. I have a question about architecture being a living document. Obviously, we can go, I guess, through endless number of. Is that close enough?
It will not be a living document, but it
Right.
will be an RFC targeted document with a publication date in the future.
Okay, let me rephrase my question. So,
Thank you.
given that WIMSE will evolve over time and we will accept eventually more use cases, but architecture should be published at some point. We need to have line in the sand. I wonder, should maybe current delivery be called WIMSE Architecture 1.0, similarly how this is done in OAuth? So then once that is delivered and new use cases are adopted, we might be working on 1.1 or 2.0 or whatever numbering scheme happens to be.
Oh gosh. Go ahead.
As chair, predictions are hard, especially about the future. And so I think let's first get to the first architecture document and have that finished. And I think if at that point it appears that we need a follow-on, an errata, an update, let's figure it out at that point. But maybe let's first get to a place where this is a problem.
Yeah, and also OAuth is not a great example for how to properly version things. Yeah, well, so there's 1.0, 1.0a, which is not compatible with 1.0, but kind of is, depending on which part you look at it. Then there's 2.0 and there's 2.1, and it's, yeah, I'm sorry, this is, I could rant for a long time on this. As chair, though, my recommendation to the working group aligns with Peter's, and that's let's write the document as the WIMSE architecture, as the artifact that we have. And if we can agree on what a versioning means for that, and we want to treat this as being able to publish multiple RFCs that update and obsolete and all of that over time, that's something we can figure out as we work on it. That said, I am a firm believer in that IDs are cheap. Draft numbers are cheap. And as we iterate and change this, if there's more that can go into this as it goes, then that's a mechanism that we should be using. All right. So, go ahead,
George.
Oh, thanks. I didn't see that.
So obviously overlap between some of the documents that we want to produce here and other places. What's our sort of thinking for, dealing with that, and our best ways to handle that? Is it just like make sure the same, we've got good cross-pollination or whatever? I think we need to be thinking about what that looks like. The other part that I think was useful in what you described here is that, and maybe this comes up specifically in the architecture, is to look at where are the boundaries between different aspects of what we're trying to solve. Transactions are probably at a higher layer than let's potentially call it workload identities, though they're related. And then, how do we sort of connect the boundaries, or the layering? Not quite sure the right words to use here, but I kind of feel like we're starting to talk about different conceptual things, and being very clear about what those are is probably something that should go in the architecture document. And then that will help, as we look at the actual specifics for, protocols and things of that nature.
All right. Thank you. Great points. All right. So at this point, we're going to go back through each of those deliverables, because as a working group, it's our job to deliver documents. Yarn, you're giving me a look.
Yeah, sorry if it's premature, but my sense of document adoption is you need to have a document first before you can adopt it. And in our case, we don't have that many. For example, Joe talked about a document that's still on GitHub, which means it's not an official ID yet. Oh, it is?
Yeah.
Sorry.
You're correct. Your question is premature. Thank you. Thank you, though. It's an important question, but yeah, no, it's something that we definitely need to address. So as we start talking about how to apply documents to each of these, and we're going to go back through each of these deliverables, I want people to keep the following things in mind. First off, the deliverable to document ratio is not necessarily 1-to-1. You can deliver a deliverable in multiple documents. You can sometimes deliver multiple deliverables in a single document, depending on how things get sliced and diced. So a lot of these questions of like, oh, wait, is this BCP actually part of the architecture? I don't know, maybe it is. That's something that we should figure out as we start to actually build out the text. Second is that please keep in mind, as we're considering all of these things, that all the starting documents are not final. It seems silly to say it out loud, but the number of times that in my time here, I need to remind people that the starting document is really just to get a stake in the ground that we then move beyond. And that's a really, really important thing to consider. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be complete. There's going to be holes in it. One of my personal favorite 0.0 drafts had to-do security in it, and like that warmed my heart. But that's okay at this stage. So with that in mind, and I think that this starts to also loop back around to George's question. We're going to go back through the things. Now I'm going to start with the two that we actually do have documents for. First is the WIMSE architecture. As Joe presented, we have an ID that's been submitted. There's been active work on GitHub. We have initial authors. And so the question to the working group is, would we like to adopt the WIMSE architecture document? And just a procedure question, because again, I'm a little bit rusty. Do I call for adoption of the document and then adoption of the starting document separately, or is that all one? Advice from any chair or AD. It's all one?
The choice has to be Murray, the area director. The choice has to be done on the mailing list.
Yes, of course.
You can open a call for adoption on a document as long as you have a document to attach the call to.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. All right. In which case, I'm going to get a sentiment for the room, from the room, rather. Sentiment for the room is your own business.
You're creating a poll?
Yes. So I'm going to create a poll just to get a sentiment of people in the room. First off, just a quick show of hands. Who here, again, has read or at least skimmed the WIMSE architecture? Yes?
You can just, other people can object, but I think you can just start the call on the list. That is the request for consensus. So that's, you can start the call now without having to do a hum necessarily in the room, because you're going to decide whether to adopt that document on the list anyway.
Right.
Or you can do your hum if you want. I'm just saying that I'm trying to speed things along here a little.
No, I appreciate it. We've got time.
You can also short circuit things. Like if nobody here likes it, then you can skip the call. Let the man do his call.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just getting the link. All right. All right, so just to get a sense, do we want to adopt, again, to be confirmed on the list, the WIMSE architecture draft document as the starting point for the WIMSE architecture deliverable? All right. Well, that's going through. Yeah.
Paul, I see polls in the queue while folks are voting.
Yeah, I just want to bring it up. So while the poll is still running, Paul Wouters, not the AD for this group. I find it a bit curious that now 24 people have voted yes, and we only have 10 people who said to read the document.
Yeah. There are. Okay, this is a fairly remotely attended. There's 74 people total.
Okay, never mind.
Okay. I mean, duly noted. This is all to be confirmed on the list. I'm going to close this poll though. From the chair's perspective, did you want to add?
Are you finished?
Go.
I see Hank. Hank, do you want to get in the queue, or you're in the queue?
Oh.
Yeah, maybe that was super obvious, but the question who read it was to the physical room and not a hands tool. So I think these numbers can't be compared.
Yeah, there's going to be some potential misalignment there. Good.
Sorry, Hank, I just want to confirm that I understand your concern. You're saying that the wording in the poll suggested the physical room, or no?
No, beforehand, someone asked, did you read it? And there was a ask to the room, the physical room, not a hands tool. And so
right,
hand tool and room asks are not comparable. That's all, you know.
Yep. Okay. Yep, exactly. All right. So looking at this will be, we will do an official call for consensus on the list. But the sentiment in the room is that there seems to be a lot of people who are either in favor or don't care. And nobody has registered a negative opinion. I want to wait a beat to see if anybody wants to come to the mic to say that this is not a good idea to start with this document while we're all together. I will take your silence as agreement. Sorry, sharing joke. Anyway, we will do the official call on the list, obviously. If you raised your hand during the meeting, please still speak up on the list when we put out the call for consensus, because that's the record that actually counts. And thank you. Joe, before we do that, do you want to do that quick revision that you were talking about, the cleanup revision, or do you want to start with the version that's up there now? Okay, so yeah, I was going to repeat. The response was that we'll do a quick cleanup revision of that, and get that out fairly quickly, and then bring that updated version to the list for a call for consensus. Awesome, thank you. All right, next up, can you back the slides up one, please? Can you, can you not move the slides? Oh, sorry, I thought I could. All right, next up is adopt this for token distribution. All right, next up, again, show of hands in the room, which is not comparable to the poll numbers that we're about to see. Who has read the token BCP draft that Hannes brought up? Read or at least skimmed it? I don't believe you, Hannes. All right. Go ahead. Okay. Because I'm going to start the poll.
Yeah, I wonder for the next one if we just do the poll for reading as well.
It takes too much time. All right. So we are now going to put up again to get a sentiment from the room, whether that document is a good starting point for working on this deliverable, with the notion that, again, things might get folded together, they might be refactored. That's how these things work.
And by room, we mean people in the room and attending online.
Yeah, sure. That is 100% correct. That is us that's feeding back. We have to watch that. All right, I would like to invite, it's definitely a much less strong signal here. I would like to invite anybody that has a something that they want to raise about why this document shouldn't be the start to go ahead and join the queue, and anything that we should discuss here. Again, this will be discussed on the list.
You're on.
So initially, the deliverable was tailored more or less to this document, but then there's been several discussions of extending the scope of what we mean by BCP recommendations, whatever. I'd like the scope discussions to settle down before we go off and tell the authors, you wrote about Kubernetes, but now we want you to cover A, B, and C as well, and make sure that everybody is aligned before we adopt a specific document or a specific team of editors.
All right, thank you. Ori.
Hi, Ori Steele, incoming RDD. I think the document could go through some revisions. I think security considerations could be fleshed out a bit, and I think the comments on the BCP piece and just the overall framing of the document, it felt like maybe there's some opportunity to kind of massage the text a bit more and kind of pull it together. And I'd like to see, a couple, at least a revision that accounts for some of the feedback we got, in the room today.
Thank you, Ori. I do want to remind you that to-do security is acceptable as a starting document. That said, if there are specific things that you think are missing in terms of it being a starting point that would be detrimental to it acting as the starting point, that's the type of thing that I want to make sure is actually captured. It's definitely not ready yet, or we'd just hand it to the AD and make it an RFC and we'd all go home. Hannes, go ahead.
Yeah, I was about to head in the same direction. It's not yet asking for working group as called. It's just the adoption. Although I remember Joe and I remember Bernard de Boer chairing Radex, and there the adoption call was not too far off from a working group last call. You basically had to work 3 years to get the document adopted into a state where you basically only had a few editorial errors anymore. But I think I don't have a strong opinion on this BCP versus other state of the document. I don't think it will impact much the rest of the content. So, but it's up to the group to decide what how to frame the document in terms of the type of the document.
Thank you. Evan.
Yeah, I just wanted to, Evan Gilman, Spiral. I just wanted to kind of, give +1 on Jörn's comment. And I think this is evidenced in, the presentation that Hannes gave, or the first bullet point is talking very specific about, JOT and Kubernetes, and there are certain kinds of invariants in that environment don't exist in others. And the second bullet point was more general around issuance, and there was a little, it's kind of where does this part go? My feeling is that the document, as it exists today, is fairly narrowly scoped purposefully around that first bullet point. But this slide, as written, token distribution, is the more general version. And so, before adopting, I would probably want to know which is the shape that we're going for, and maybe right size a little bit.
Thank you, Evan. I do want to just step in as chair for a moment, in that this document could be one of several documents that fulfill this deliverable, and the working group should keep that in mind. It does not need to be a one-to-one mapping. Jörn.
Yeah, so so now I'm even more confused. So I'm totally with Evan on we need to decide what the scope is. I couldn't care less about the BCP versus AS versus whatever. But I think we are saying that we are adopting this document as the deliverable number, whatever this is, for, as a starting point for this deliverable. I think it is not ready even as a starting point for this until we as a group define the scope.
All right, thank you. All right, So what I'm taking from that is that as part of the call to the list, we're going to be soliciting discussion on what the appropriate scope of the target scope of the document is going to be. Whether people are looking for a document for the specific narrow scope, for the wider scope, for something else, and let that inform how people are discussing this for adoption. Would framing the question like that, again on the list where we've got a little bit more flexibility, would that help clarify the kinds of things that you're doing? I'm looking specifically to Yaron and a bit to Hannes.
So I would suggest that when we put the question to the list, if there's a possibility of having 2 or 3 documents address this deliverable, let's put it out there explicitly.
Sounds good. Okay. Okay. So yep. Okay. So rolling back, token exchange. This is one that we do not have a WIMSE specific document for at this point. So we are going to throw it out to the group here. Anybody got a document? No, for really though. Does anybody want to take on putting together a 0-0 draft that might address this or start pointing in the right direction or something like that? We will also put the call to the list. But today we are looking for people to say, hey, I would like to sit down and try to see what shape this could be. Ori?
All right, Ori Steele. I just wanted to ask, like, for this document, we had presentations from the OAuth group of relevant work within OAuth. I'm wondering if there's been any discussion around, why is it that this piece of OAuth work isn't good enough? And is this one of those cases, or could someone with, additional context maybe kind of say, oh, like you totally read that wrong. This thing is not a thing that OAuth has ever even considered, or just like some additional context. And maybe if someone hears that, they'll say, oh, I could do the draft that'll actually pull that apart.
It may well be that some of the work, like the transaction token draft, may either be a template for, or it may just be the thing that we need here. But I think until we see something written down as a proposal, we don't really know. And so I think the first thing is there a proposal that we can look at that and then reason over whether it is sufficiently different from what we could achieve or get from the transaction token draft, for example.
Or identity chaining
at this point. Identity chaining, yeah.
So, but yes, some of both. But the fact that it's arguably bits of both might actually be part of that discussion. So if part of the proposal is moving documents between working groups, I do not know the procedures for things like that. Obviously, it would require a lot of coordination between not only working groups but also areas in our cases. But if that is a proposal that the working groups and especially the existing authors and chairs want to consider, then that's something that we should put on the table.
George
Fletcher. I guess for me, this feels a little bit underspecified. It's kind of like, we know that we will probably need something in this space, but we really don't know what, which feels like way early to even start working on a document. I'd love to sort of collect what we think the core problems are from this work group's perspective in this space. And then it would be a whole lot easier to say, yes, we can leverage these bits of identity chaining, or we need something completely new, or if we could just get the identity chaining to make these few small tweaks, then we could just use it outright. But none of those options are really it's not, we don't know how to take any of those options without having a little bit more clarity here. So I guess that would be my recommendation, is to try to get more clarity from the list around what problems are in this space, and then we can probably make some better decisions.
Thank you, George. Yaroslav.
Yeah, I'd like to second that. I think in addition to all specific cases in terms of chaining, there is also potential challenge that we would need to resolve of, well, WIMSE token is not necessarily OAuth token. It could be something else. It could be SPIFFE. It could be X509 certificate. And translation of that on the boundary of some boundary would be an interesting challenge. And also security and privacy considerations might come into play in terms of token exchange, again, at the boundaries. So I believe those use cases are certainly worth a dedicated document. Should that be a single document, or should that be multiple documents? I don't think it's clear at this point.
Thank you. Yarn.
So maybe two other procedural ways of looking at this. One is your good old design team. You could set up a design team to talk about token exchange and come up with ideas, and eventually maybe come up with a drafty draft for token exchange. Alternatively, the way I was thinking about it, at least initially, is that the architecture document and the architecture team would dive into exactly the right altitude to decide whether, for example, RFC 8693 does it for us and we're happy and we can skip this deliverable altogether, or whether there's 2 or 3 missing things. They could list those 2 or 3 missing things, and then we could start work on this. But that means that we are waiting on the architecture team to go there.
So what I am hearing as chair is Yaron volunteering to be part of a design team. And I actually do want to, teasing aside, I actually would like to ask the folks here and anybody online, is anybody willing / interested in being part of a design team to dive deep on this for a limited period of time and then report back to the group as to what this might look like? If so in the room, raise your hand. Okay. Yeah, we've got a few folks in the room, a few very tentative hands. This is not commitment to write and edit a draft. This is to discuss and see where things are. We've got Arndt +1 on chat as well. So I think that's enough to put out a call to the list to get whether it's a formal design team or just make sure a bunch of people are looking at this, get something together on this one. So. Cool. All right. Walking back one, the local token issuance. This is you get to make your own access tokens and be your own security boss. So again, this is one we do not have a document for. This also happens to be one where there is not, to my knowledge, an extant document that really talks about any type of best practices, even though a bunch of people are doing this, which is terrifying. George is coming to Mike. Did you have? Oh, okay. Feeds back.
Sorry, George Fletcher again. In the sense of documents that may or may not be findable in the Wayback Machine, the Liberty Alliance produced something called SHIPS, which I don't remember exactly what it stands for, which was about how do you convey basically authority to produce tokens from a central IDP to a client. And it was more for offline use cases, like I need to, my phone needs to be able to create a credential or create a token and present it in some context that's disconnected from the internet. Sorry, but there is probably some work there that is conveyable here, because in the same context, you want to understand what authority does the local issuer have to produce tokens.
All right. Thank you, George. Can I ask if you can possibly dig up some of that Liberty Alliance stuff, or at least a reference? That would be helpful. Okay, thank you. Whatever you can find. All right. So I'm not quite sure what action we can take on this immediately. It sounds like this is something that the working group needs to figure out a little bit more about what's out there. Richard?
Yeah, just cheering from the floor a little bit here. Like, there's nothing that says the working group needs to have all of its deliverables in progress at the same time. So like, some stuff can just hang fire.
Oh yeah. We're good. I'm just trying to get so part of my goal from this meeting is figuring out which of those were like ready to start getting whacked on with axes and which aren't. This one is feeling a lot more like it's not yet. And finally, protecting service-to-service traffic. This is one that, at least the conversations going in, there seems to be a lot more sort of concrete pieces to this. Parts of this do look and feel a lot like transaction tokens in the OAuth world. So I'm just going to, unless somebody jumps right on the queue here, I'm going to say that we should take a similar approach that we did to the that we are going to do with the token exchange, and ask a handful of people to go poke this a little bit and see what's there. It does seem to feel like those two kind of not exactly fit together, but they're a little bit related. So with that, gauging intent of participation, who would be willing to be part of a team looking specifically into service-to-service traffic? Yeah, Yaron, Joe, Hannes, yeah, a few folks. More in the back, online.
Anybody online?
Evan too. Okay. So importantly, not just the same set of people. So that is good. All right. And so that's the full set of deliverables that we've told the ISG that we're going to work on at some point here. So looking across these, it feels like we've got a solid start for at least one. Ironically, the one that we think will be delivered latest. So who knows? Who knows? This is an adventure. But the chairs have been taking notes, and we've got actions to take on just about all of these, and we will follow up all of that on the list. And with that, we've got a few minutes. So any other business? Richard, nothing? No. Atul.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering, Justin, you had talked about that sort of bag of tokens kind of thing. Is that going to be something you're working on in this working group?
So in short, it is not among the working group's deliverables at this time, no. If somebody else wants to pick up that work and see how it fits into what we've said we're going to deliver, because personally, I think it fits well in the server-to-server traffic milieu.
Yeah, I would
Not
be
exactly,
specific.
but
I would be interested in solving that bag of tokens problem, and so I can work with Evan on that, I guess.
okay, yeah. So the other thing I want to say is that one of the things that Peter and I want to encourage in this working group is that if people have good ideas that are related to the stuff that's beyond just what the working group is working on, write an ID. Let's have the conversations. Let's build the implementations. Like, we really want WIMSE to be a very powerful forum for all of these kinds of things, even if it's not stuff that is a working group track deliverable at this time, right? Because this is there's a vast set of things that we could do here. And that the token bucket thing might be that at some point, or it might not. But if people are interested in iterating that, I think WIMSE is a perfectly reasonable place to have those conversations, even though it is an ID, an individual draft, not a working group draft. We actually want to encourage that type of discussion and engagement, to the point where that is actually a line in the charter that we specifically want to hold the WIMSE list as a forum for things that are outside of our deliverable list. We were very, very adamant about making sure that that was part of our charter. So yeah, Atul, I encourage you to do that. All right, thank you. All right, any closing thoughts?
One unrelated to WIMSE, we've been asked to remind people, please wear your badges while walking around in the facility. I see a few people in here whose badges are hidden. Sorry, but I've been asked to remind everyone.
Yeah, mine's down there so I don't jingle in the chair mic.
Same here.
But yes.
Brian, you want to come up to the mic? Jingle bells, there he comes.
I think I'm confused maybe on the scope of the service-to-service traffic stuff. You kind of portrayed it as potentially similar to the transactional token stuff and maybe building on the token buckety stuff. I know previously, Peter, you had talked about something Depop-esque for like doing more of a proof of possession type token-based service-to-service authentication. And maybe it's just me, but I'm kind of confused about the direction of or the hopes out of that deliverable.
Yeah.
Or does that even make sense?
No, I just want to get the text back up. So I think one of the things that we talked about, that Justin and I talked about, was, again, there might have to be multiple documents here, and there may have to be, my belief is there are some really tactical near-term things that we need to get done. And it may be that we look at one of those, or that we look at an approach that maybe looks more like the Depop approach, right? Where we have proof of possession with a proof format that we can easily distribute or use. And that might be one of the deliverables that can be combined with something like transaction tokens or other drafts. But I think I think what we're looking for is proposals that we can use to sort of maybe even decompose the problem. So it doesn't have to be one document. And I would love for us to maybe, that problem about the problem around sender constraining tokens. I think Richard brought that up several times as well. Finding some kind of way to make it so that I cannot take and lift one of these tokens, steal it, and replay it. That is something that I'd love to see some proposals for sure.
All right, we have 2 minutes left. Hannes.
Yeah, someone mentioned DKIM earlier, and I think there's actually a good body of prior work in the IETF on doing that type of application layer security across multiple hops. DKIM, SIP stuff, messaging, they all have a similar pattern where you traverse multiple hops who modify something along the way that you cannot just protect. So you need to be extremely careful on which field you include. If you include too little, replay becomes very easy. If you include too many, it becomes unusable. And so there's a fine line you need to dance here. And the SIP identity people would probably tell you like how tough that was. And so it's going to be interesting.
Thank you. And finally, Oliver.
Yeah, I have one question. Do you believe that this would
especially the service traffic, identity management, and all this stuff could include zero trust, or do you think that would be out of scope?
If this working group can agree on what zero trust means, then I think we can answer that question. And that is not just me being, pithy here. I think that we actually would have to agree on what we meant before we decided whether that was in or out.
Okay, that's fair.
I want to say that a little differently, maybe. I think a lot of the technology and building blocks that we have, or we are developing here, are key to creating least privilege access type in architectures, and that maps, fairly closely to things that fall under the zero trust marketing moniker. But yes, so I think what we'll do here will be incredibly relevant, but maybe we should just stick to things like least privilege rather than the zero trust type.
Yaroslav, we're out of time. Sorry. So thank you all very much. We'll see you on the list, and welcome to WIMSE. Let's get to work. Thanks. Thank you. That went well.
My favorite part of IETF, watching my
Oh, laptop. And they all hate each other. Oh.